When I first decided to move my operations to the lakefront property, I knew it was going to raise a few eyebrows in the HOA, but I wasn't prepared for just how hostile the reaction would be. The lake had been at the center of drama for years, mostly because the HOA board loved to act as if they owned every grain of sand around it. The truth, which I discovered after a few late nights combing through county records, was that the lake wasn't owned by the HOA at all. It was technically public access property with a few leased rights. Better yet, I'd managed to purchase the surrounding lots that gave me prime control over the docks, the boat slips, and most of the commercial frontage. This was no small investment. I had spent months working with my attorney, zoning officials, and the county registrar to secure the rights. By the time we moved into the new office on the east bank of the lake, my team and I had every permit we needed, every license framed and posted on the wall, and even the blessing of the county commissioner, who had quietly thanked me for taking over the management of a space that had been neglected for far too long. That first morning in the new office was perfect. The smell of fresh paint still lingered in the hallways, and my staff was busy unpacking boxes, setting up desks, and rolling in filing cabinets. The sun reflected off the calm lake water, sending flickers of light dancing across the floor through the big panoramic windows. I stood there with a cup of black coffee, soaking it all in, thinking to myself that this was going to be the start of something big. I wasn't just here to run a business, I was here to take this lake back from the petty tyrants who had been intimidating anyone who dared use it without paying their fees. Word must have spread faster than I imagined, because before lunch, I saw her. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, came storming down the wooden dock like she was leading an army. She was dressed in her usual oversized sun hat, mirrored sunglasses, and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on the chest. Her mouth was already moving before she even opened the office door. My assistant tried to intercept her politely, but Karen brushed right past him, acting like she had legal authority to inspect whatever she pleased. She barged into my office, slapped her handbag on the desk, and started rattling off some nonsense about unauthorized occupation of HOA property and pending fines. I didn't say a word at first. I just leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee, letting her rant as if she was reading a script she'd been preparing for weeks. Then the door opened again, but this time it wasn't my assistant. It was the governor of the state himself, stepping into the room with a smile. He had come down for a quiet, private meeting to discuss a potential conservation grant we were partnering on. The moment Karen saw him, she froze mid-sentence. The color drained from her face as she realized she had just barged into a meeting that was way above her pay grade. She stammered something about coming back later, and backed out of the room so fast I thought she might trip over her own sandals. The governor raised an eyebrow, glanced at me, and chuckled. "I take it you've met the neighborhood welcoming committee," he said. I laughed and nodded, but deep down, I knew this was just the beginning. Because if I knew anything about Karen, it was that she didn't back down easily, and if today rattled her this much, she was going to double down tomorrow. Sure enough, the very next morning, before the coffee pot had even finished brewing, I heard the sound of tires crunching across the gravel parking lot outside. When I stepped out onto the porch of the office, there she was again, Karen, only this time, she wasn't alone. 3 other members of the HOA board had come with her, clipboards in hand, their expressions grim and determined. They looked like they were about to conduct a military inspection, which was funny to me because technically, they had no authority here whatsoever. Still, I knew what they were doing. They were staging a scene. If they couldn't intimidate me with words, they'd try to overwhelm me with paperwork and official-looking gestures. I motioned for my assistant to start recording everything with his phone, just in case they tried anything illegal. The moment Karen saw the camera, her lips tightened, but she kept going. She began rattling off a list of violations she claimed we had committed: excessive noise, improper signage, unauthorized vehicle parking, misuse of lake access, and my personal favorite, trespassing. I couldn't help but grin at that last one. I waited until she was finished, then calmly stepped off the porch and handed her a copy of the deed for the surrounding lots, along with the signed lease agreement that gave me full authority over the boat slips. "You don't own this property," I said in a level voice, making sure the camera caught every word. "In fact, you have no jurisdiction here whatsoever. This office is privately owned, and I have every right to operate my business here. Now, if you have a legitimate complaint, you're welcome to file it with the county clerk, but you will not step foot on this property again without an invitation." The look on her face was priceless, a mix of fury, embarrassment, and disbelief. She clearly wasn't used to being challenged like this. The other board members exchanged nervous glances, suddenly less sure about the purpose of their little visit. Karen sputtered something about calling an emergency HOA meeting and stormed off, her sandals slapping against the wooden planks of the dock. By that afternoon, my prediction came true. Flyers started appearing on community bulletin boards announcing a mandatory HOA meeting to discuss illegal lake occupation and potential community hazards. I knew exactly what was going on. Karen was going to try and turn the entire neighborhood against me. This was her favorite move: gather a crowd, stir them up with fear, and pressure whoever she was targeting until they backed down. But this time, I wasn't backing down. When the evening of the meeting arrived, I showed up 15 minutes early, dressed in a pressed shirt and boots, carrying a thick binder of documents under my arm. The community hall was already half full, and the atmosphere was tense. People turned to stare at me as I walked in, whispering among themselves. Karen was standing at the front of the room with a smug look on her face, clearly believing she had the upper hand. The meeting began with her usual theatrics, slideshows, photos, and cherry-picked quotes from bylaws that she twisted to sound like I was breaking every rule in the book. Then she opened the floor to comments, expecting a chorus of angry neighbors to back her up. Instead, I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and calmly laid out my case. I presented the deeds, the permits, the zoning maps, and the county's written confirmation that my business had every legal right to operate on the lakefront. Then, just to make sure everyone understood where things stood, I played a short video clip of the governor shaking my hand in my office just the day before, thanking me for investing in the lakefront revitalization project. The room went dead silent. You could practically hear Karen's ego deflating. A few neighbors even clapped. One older man stood up and said, "If he's got the governor backing him, maybe we should be glad someone's finally taking care of the lake." Karen tried to recover, but the damage was done. Her big dramatic moment had backfired completely. When the meeting ended, several of the residents came up to shake my hand and thank me for putting up with all the drama. Karen, on the other hand, stood by the door glaring at me, her jaw clenched so tight I thought she might break a tooth. I knew what that look meant: she wasn't done with me yet. And if there was one thing I had learned about people like her, it was that they got meaner the more they felt their control slipping away. I walked back to my truck that night with a strange sense of calm. The first battle was over, and I had won. But I also knew the war was just beginning. Over the next week, Karen's campaign against me kicked into overdrive. I had expected her to lick her wounds after that disastrous HOA meeting, maybe even take a break and cool off, but I underestimated how far she was willing to go to protect what she thought was her territory. It started with anonymous complaints filed with the county about supposed environmental violations on the lakefront. Then, the sheriff's department sent a deputy out to investigate a noise complaint that turned out to be completely fabricated. We hadn't even been playing music that day. Every morning, I found new printed notices taped to my office door claiming that I owed community fees or special assessments, despite my property being legally exempt from HOA jurisdiction. Instead of losing my temper, I documented everything. I had my assistant photograph every notice, record every visit, and file every letter in a growing binder labeled HOA Harassment. I knew that sooner or later, this would come in handy. Then came the so-called inspection. One Tuesday morning, while I was out on the dock overseeing some work being done on the boat slips, I saw a group of 4 people in safety vests walking toward the property with clipboards and cameras. At first, I thought they were county officials, but when I got closer, I recognized one of them. It was Karen, wearing a vest she had clearly ordered online to make herself look official. She announced that she was conducting a safety and compliance inspection and demanded access to the building. I nearly laughed in her face. "This is private property," I said, standing squarely in the doorway. "You are trespassing. You are not authorized to be here, and if you step 1 foot inside this building, I will have you removed." Karen crossed her arms and tried to stare me down, but I didn't budge. My foreman, a big guy who used to be a Marine, came and stood beside me just to make sure she got the message. After a long moment, Karen turned on her heel and stalked off, yelling over her shoulder that this isn't over. That night, I called my attorney. We filed a cease and desist letter against the HOA for harassment and unauthorized attempts to interfere with my business operations. The next day, I emailed copies of the letter to every single board member and posted one on the community bulletin board. But the real turning point came a few days later when I got a phone call from the governor's office. Apparently, he had heard about the harassment I was dealing with and wanted to come down personally to see how the lake project was progressing. I told him what had been happening, and he didn't seem surprised at all. Apparently, Karen's reputation for overstepping her authority had reached his office long before I ever got involved. When the governor arrived that Friday, I made sure to invite several key community members, local business owners, and even a reporter from the county newspaper to the dock to witness the visit. We gave the governor a tour of the facilities, showed him the improvements we had made, and laid out our future plans for making the lake a better place for everyone. And wouldn't you know it, halfway through the tour, Karen showed up again, this time with a small group of loyal HOA members in tow, probably hoping to cause a scene. Instead, she found herself face to face with the governor, who shook her hand politely before saying, "I understand you've been giving this man a hard time. You should know that we fully support this project. It's going to bring in tourism revenue and improve property values for everyone around the lake." The look on Karen's face was priceless. For the second time in a week, she had been completely humiliated, this time in front of half the neighborhood. By the end of the day, the newspaper had published a glowing article about my work on the lakefront, complete with a picture of me and the governor standing side by side. I pinned a copy of that article to the office bulletin board right where Karen could see it the next time she came snooping around. I knew she wasn't finished, not by a long shot. But at this point, she was running out of options. Every time she tried to come after me, she made herself look worse. And I had a growing stack of evidence that was just waiting to be used if she pushed me too far. If there's one thing I've learned about people like Karen, it's that humiliation doesn't make them stop, it makes them desperate. And desperate people do reckless things. The following week, I found out just how far she was willing to go when I received a thick envelope in the mail, delivered by certified post. Inside was a legal notice from the HOA's attorney claiming that I was in violation of several community codes and demanding that I cease operations immediately. It was laughable. The codes they cited didn't even apply to my property, but I knew what Karen was trying to do. She was hoping to drag me into a costly legal battle that would tie me up in court for months. Instead of panicking, I called my lawyer, who practically laughed out loud when he read the letter. "They don't have a case," he said. "This is nothing but intimidation." Still, we decided to take it seriously. My attorney drafted a formal response not only rejecting their claims but also warning that if they continued their harassment, we would file a lawsuit against the HOA for damages, legal fees, and defamation. That's when I decided to stop playing defense and go on the offensive. I spent the next few days compiling every piece of evidence I had collected: videos of Karen trespassing, photos of her unauthorized postings, recordings of her making threats during the meetings, and documentation of every fake complaint filed against me. My lawyer helped me assemble everything into a neat, organized file, complete with timestamps and witness statements. Then, we filed an official complaint with the county government and requested that they review the HOA's conduct. We also filed for a restraining order against Karen personally, which meant she could no longer set foot on my property or interfere with my employees. Word of the restraining order spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Some residents were furious at Karen for dragging them into this mess. Others were secretly relieved that someone had finally stood up to her. I started noticing small shifts in the community's attitude. People who had once glared at me from their porches were now stopping by to chat, offering to bring their kids by for a tour of the lake, asking when they could start using the new docks. Karen, meanwhile, was unraveling. She called another emergency HOA meeting, but this time, barely a dozen people showed up. I heard from a neighbor that she spent the whole meeting ranting about corruption and government conspiracies before storming out in tears. A week later, I got a call from the county commissioner's office informing me that they had completed their review. The verdict? The HOA had overstepped its authority repeatedly and would be issued a formal warning. They were ordered to stop harassing me and to respect the legal property boundaries. Failure to comply would result in fines and possible removal of the board. When that news hit the community bulletin board, it was like a bomb going off. Within days, several board members resigned, citing personal reasons. Karen was suddenly very quiet. She stopped posting on social media, stopped showing up to community events, and for the first time since I'd moved in, I didn't see her patrolling the neighborhood in her golf cart. I should have felt victorious, and in a way, I did, but I also knew there was one final step I needed to take to make sure this war was truly over. I worked with my attorney to set up a formal lakefront partnership with the county, giving me partial management rights over the public access areas and securing a long-term agreement to maintain and improve the space. This not only protected my business but ensured that no HOA board, present or future, could ever try to pull this stunt again. By the time the paperwork was signed, sealed, and recorded, Karen's reign of terror was officially over. The first morning after the agreement with the county became official, I walked down to the lake with a cup of coffee and just stood there for a moment, taking it all in. The sun was rising over the water, casting everything in gold. The new docks were almost finished, the landscaping crew was planting native shrubs along the shoreline, and my staff was already setting up for the day's activities. What had once been a place of constant conflict now felt peaceful, almost serene. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was cultural. The community's entire attitude toward the lake had shifted. Instead of seeing it as some guarded, exclusive playground for the HOA elite, people were beginning to treat it as the shared treasure it was meant to be. Families were coming down on weekends to fish off the docks, kids were running around on the grassy shorelines, and local businesses were benefiting from the extra foot traffic the revitalization was bringing. Even the county had started to invest more into the area, approving new walking trails and benches along the east bank. I had worried that my conflict with Karen would create lasting resentment, but the opposite seemed to happen. Once people saw the results, they began thanking me for standing my ground. Several neighbors even told me that they'd been too scared to challenge the HOA in the past because they didn't want to deal with Karen's wrath. Now that she'd been stripped of her power, they felt like they could finally breathe again. As for Karen herself, she had all but vanished from the public eye. She quietly resigned from the HOA board, citing health reasons, though I suspect it was less about health and more about humiliation. She sold her house a few months later and moved to another town. The new HOA board, free of her influence, actually reached out to me to apologize for the trouble she'd caused and offered to work together moving forward. I accepted, cautiously, not because I needed their help, but because I wanted to show the community that this was about progress, not revenge. 1 year later, standing on the deck of my office, I watched as the governor himself cut the ribbon on a new community pier, a joint project funded by my company and a state development grant. The event drew a crowd of nearly everyone in the neighborhood, along with reporters from 3 local stations. As the cameras flashed, I couldn't help but think back to that first day when Karen stormed into my office, ranting about illegal occupation and threatening fines. That single moment had sparked a chain of events that changed everything. In the end, this fight wasn't just about me or my business, it was about proving that bullies don't get to run communities unchecked. It was about reminding everyone that laws exist for a reason, and that property rights matter. And maybe, just maybe, it was about giving this town back a piece of its heart that had been stolen by fear and control. I raised my coffee cup toward the lake, took a deep breath of the fresh morning air, and smiled. The war was over, and we'd won.